Good. Hello, I'm Elizabeth Barrett. I'll be the moderator for this important webinar. And we will begin. I will introduce our expert panelists, and then they will give their presentations. I will ask them questions, and then you as the audience can ask questions. If you don't have the Q&A icon on the bottom of the screen, just click more and it will show Q&A. Thank you all for joining us. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And I'll begin by introducing our panelists. Benjamin Smith is the Senior Child Labor Specialist of the International Labor Organization, and he's worked with governments, business, labor organizations, and civil society to eliminate child labor for over 20 years. He began his career with the ILO in Central America, supporting efforts to eliminate child labor in the region, and he led a groundbreaking project to tackle the worst forms of child labor in El Salvador, where he met another one of our panelists, at ILO headquarters in Geneva, where he is now. Benjamin spearheaded the creation of the Child Labor Platform, a business network to address child labor in supply chain. And we also have Jessica Lanewand. She serves as the Chief Legal Officer and General Counsel of UNICEF USA, overseeing all legal regulatory compliance and governance matters on behalf of UNICEF. She also leads the organization's public policy and government affairs work and serves as the organization's child safeguarding officer. And Zema Neff is the executive director of Human Rights Watch's Children Rights Division. Under her leadership, HRW has launched their work on education and armed conflict, child rights and technology, secondary education, hazardous child labor, child's reproductive rights, and other issues. Zema has over 2 decades of experience documenting human rights abuses and has authored reports and articles on a range of abuses against children, including on child labor in the US. And now if we can begin, Benjamin, do you want to talk about the ILO conventions and the Convention on the Rights of the Child? Although the US, the only country in the world which hasn't ratified the latter. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks to ABA for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon. So indeed, I would like to just touch on some global statistics before turning to the definition of child labor, in fact, by unpacking a little bit the ILO conventions on the topic, and then also the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So in terms of the big picture, how many children are there in the world? 160 million who are in child labor, and about half, 79 million, are in hazardous work that's putting in jeopardy their health and safety. So that's 1 in 10 children globally. And in regions like sub-Saharan Africa, it's closer to 1 in 4. So it's a tragedy, obviously, that affects the lives of these children, but also whole economies, because the future workforce is going to be limited because they don't have access to education, and so it's the entire workforces suffer as a result of the problem. So what is child labor? Often it's defined as work that deprives children of their childhood, their dignity, and their potential, and it's harmful to their physical and mental development. So it's work that is physically, socially, or morally dangerous and harmful. and or interferes with their schooling by depriving them of the opportunity to go to school, or obliging them to drop out, to leave prematurely, or requiring them to try to combine school with work that's excessively long and heavy. So what it's not, and this is important to recall, that it's we're not talking about childhood or household chores, nor is it a question of children above, the legal age working after school or on school holidays for pocket money. So just to be clear about that. Okay, so the ILO conventions dealing with child labor, the first one adopted in 1973 is the Convention 138 on minimum age. And this calls for countries that have ratified it, and 176 countries have ratified it. So it's only 11 more countries to go before we have universal ratification of Convention 138. So it requires a national policy for the effective abolition of child labor, and to progressively raise the minimum age for entry into work to a level consistent with their fullest possible mental and physical development. Now, there's a recommendation that accompanies the convention that goes into a bit what these policies could provide for, and that's poverty alleviation, the main root cause of child labor, and the promotion of decent jobs for adults. So making that link with the ability of parents to earn enough money so that they can send their children to school and out of work, and stay out of work. Free compulsory basic education, extension of Social Security, basic social protection are elements of the policies that this recommendation calls for. So the countries that ratify commit to putting children, making child welfare a priority in their plans and kind of national development strategies. And indeed, around the world, countries have adopted national action plans on child labor to put into to implement what the Convention 138 requires. So minimum age, what is it? It's 15, although developing countries have the option to set it as a transitional measure at 14. Whatever the minimum age is, it should be the same as the compulsory school leaving age. So there's not any gap between those two. Countries have the option to allow light work. So this is work that doesn't interfere with going to school or the ability to benefit from education. So time to study, time to rest, to be able to succeed in the classroom. And that can be set at 13 if the minimum age is 15, or at 12 if it's at 14. And then 18 is the minimum age across the board for hazardous work, and I'll get into what that is. It's basically work that by its nature or the circumstances that it's carried out is likely to jeopardize children's health, safety, and kind of moral development. So work by its nature, you can think of things like mining, like there's no safe work underground for children. Spraying of pesticides, just by its nature, is hazardous. When we think of circumstances or conditions, long hours, night work, so work that may otherwise be safe, if it's done under these sorts of circumstances, becomes hazardous. So the conventions are kind of devolve the responsibility for determining what is hazardous work to the national level. So workers and employers organizations, along with governments, determine what are called hazardous work lists and in each ratifying country. So turning to the second convention that on child labor, this is the worst forms of child labor convention adopted in 1999, so Convention 182. This has been universally ratified, so it's the first convention in ILO's history to be universally ratified, and it calls for immediate and effective measures to eliminate the worst forms as a matter of that sense of urgency is really what it conveys. So worst forms of child labor being all forms of slavery or similar practices like debt bondage, sale and trafficking of children, or forced recruitment of children into armed conflict, the use, procuring, or offering of children for commercial sexual exploitation, and then the same use of children for illicit activities being the third. The fourth category of worst forms of child labor is hazardous work that I just described. So Convention 182 calls for, among other things, effective sanctions and enforcement. So this is critical, but also time-bound measures with the idea that children in danger cannot wait. So time-limited measures to prevent the worst forms of child labor, provide direct assistance to affected children, and ensure that they have access, children withdrawn from worst forms have access to free basic education, and then to take into account the special circumstances situation of girls. So now I'd like to briefly talk about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. As you mentioned, Elizabeth, nearly universally ratified. It was adopted in 1990 and talks about child labor in its Article 32, and there's no any contradiction, or it's actually quite aligned with the ILO convention. So the CRC requires states parties to recognize the right of the child to be protected from economic exploitation and for performing any work that's likely to be hazardous or interfere with their education. Or any way harmful to their health, physical, mental, spiritual, moral, or social development. It also requires states to take legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures to ensure that that takes place, the implementation of that. And to that end, and having regard to relevant standards and other international instruments, so basically the ILO conventions, state parties to the CRC should provide for a minimum age or minimum ages for admission to employment, and then appropriate regulation of the hours and the conditions of employment for children who have reached the minimum age. And then finally, to provide for, again, appropriate penalties and sanctions to ensure the effective enforcement of the presence of Article 32. So I hope that was helpful in outlining the international kind of legal architecture around child labor. So back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. And Jess, could you mention the Department of Labor laws and also the rollback that the states have on prevention?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. And thanks to the ABA for having me to speak about the increase in child labor, particularly hazardous child labor, as Benjamin was alluding to, in the United States, and applicable legal restrictions. So at the federal level, as Elizabeth mentioned, the Fair Labor Standards Act generally prohibits the employment of minors in non-agricultural jobs under the age of 14. Restricts the hours and types of work that can be performed by minors under 16, and prohibits the employment of minors under the age of 18 in any hazardous occupations, which again, Benjamin described under international law. And those include things like excavation and mining, as he mentioned, operation of power-driven equipment and the like. Different child labor law standards apply to agricultural employment, and Zema will speak about that later in the panel. The U.S. Department of Labor is the agency charged with enforcing these provisions of the FLSA. But state law of varying degrees of rigor also regulates use of child labor in the United States. And unfortunately, over the last several years, this is really where we've seen a rollback in protections. There's been a push toward rolling back these protections at the state level. A recent report by the Economic Policy Institute noted that at least 12 states very recently have passed laws to weaken child labor laws. These include Wisconsin, Ohio, West Virginia, Alabama, Kentucky, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Michigan, Tennessee, Arkansas, Indiana, and Iowa. Some of these laws eliminate age verification and parent-guardian permissions. Others lift restrictions on hazardous work. And I think Iowa's has been widely reported as the most severe in that it lifts restrictions on hazardous work and grants employer immunity from civil liability for workplace injuries. Many of these proposed changes or enacted changes to state child labor laws are weaker than or contradict the FLSA. So the FLSA you can think of as setting kind of the floor in terms of wages, hours, and child labor standards. And where state laws are weaker than those provided in the FLSA, federal law generally preempts the weaker state standard. In practice, workers are covered by the FLSA if their work touches interstate commerce. So weaker state standards legally apply to a smaller subset of employment situations, but are extremely significant just because, both because I think these state protections actually force companies to adhere to more stringent compliance standards in terms of verification, age verification, and protection for minors. And the Department of Labor, as we could talk about a little bit later in the panel, is pretty hamstrung in terms of resourcing for enforcement. And so state labor agencies are the ones that are kind of on the front lines in terms of enforcement. So the rollbacks are significant. And we're seeing these rollbacks at a time when child labor in the US is increasing, particularly among subcontractors and within the US supply chain. So to just look at some statistics, the Department of Labor reported a 150% increase in child labor violations from 2018 to 2023, marked by concerning rates of hazardous child labor, affecting at least 502 minors in fiscal year 23, and increases in child labor below the minimum age of 14. And it's important to keep in mind these rates, again, are reported violations, so they're complicated by the larger context of under-resourced U.S. enforcement agencies, the ongoing enactment of legislation that loosens existing child labor protections, and populations of children where child labor violations may be more difficult to track. And I think Elizabeth may have mentioned, or I know these materials have been circulated, but there have been recent media investigations and reports of child labor cases that I think provide insight into the violations across the U.S. supply chain, and insight into the way enforcement agencies are starting to think about this issue. So in February 2023, in one of the more notorious cases to date, Packer Sanitation Services received a $1.5 million penalty for employing more than 100 children in hazardous roles within meat processing facilities, cleaning dangerous equipment. Yes.
Could you mention the use of migrant children in the U.S. in hazardous industries?
I was getting to that. So yes, and these recent media investigations, they reveal child labor in additional industries like roofing, slaughterhouses, dairy factories. And there was a focus on migrant children, facing poverty and without access to social services that are being drawn into these roles. So to sort of build on that point, I think the reporting suggests several different trends and drivers of child labor in the U.S. The first is reliance on subcontractors and the so-called fissured workplace that's been reported on, where companies are able to basically outsource risk and avoid compliance responsibilities by relying on contractors and subcontractors to do their work. Packer Sanitation, I believe, is owned by Blackstone Group, for example. Unaccompanied migrant youth are vulnerable to exploitation by employers and also networks of labor brokers, staffing agencies who are recruiting specifically in these communities where children may be more vulnerable. And then rising inflation and tightening post-pandemic labor market circumstances have led to growing demand for productivity and scarcity of workers able or willing to fulfill certain roles, which has companies and industries turning to child labor as a result, or illicit labor practices. And I would say on the migrant point, Elizabeth, at UNICEF USA, we're really trying to understand the circumstances under which children are entering into these hazardous occupations so that we can advocate for a holistic approach to addressing those root causes, whether they're, our immigration system, poverty, lack of access to services, and the like, and also to ensure that the policy solutions that we're advocating for don't create unintended consequences, such as pushing children into more dangerous work, perhaps, and things of that nature.
Thanks so much, Jess. And Zamek, can you talk about children's labor use in agriculture and the effect it has on other industries?
Yes, and I want to start out by telling you about a teenager I met. I'll call her Luce. And we spoke sitting on the wooden steps coming down for her family's trailer. And she told me, she started by telling me about how she picked strawberries starting at the age of 9. She said, I really didn't decide to work. I had to because my mom was having difficulty raising us and providing us with everything we needed. I paid for food for our family to eat and the things for school that they were always asking us to bring. Now, Luce's employer paid her not by the hour, but by according to how much fruit she picked. So on many days, she said she would not even stop and rest. She said, we kept on going because if we were to sit down and take a break, we'd make even less. But despite that, Luce didn't earn very much. She earned far less than the minimum age in her country. Remember, she started at age 9, but by the time she was a teenager, she was often working 13-hour days when she wasn't in school. And she said she was often sick from pesticides. She said, you could see it all around and you were breathing it. My stomach was always heaving every single day. She fell behind in school, and she said most of her friends had already dropped out. But under the law in Luce's country, the work that she's doing is totally legal. Where Luce lives and works, children who work for hire on farms are excluded from the most basic protections enjoyed by all other working children. Now, Luce is not in India, Indonesia, El Salvador, or other places where I've investigated child labor. She was right here in the United States. Child labor was once very widespread in the US. Now it's mostly outlawed. We've seen a surge of coverage of these shocking cases of unaccompanied minors who were employed illegally in dangerous industries like construction and meat packing. And these cases are especially appalling because they're illegal. But this coverage misses one gaping hole in US law, and that is agriculture. Despite being the sector, probably the largest sector employing children in the US, the government doesn't keep accurate records, but there are estimates that there are hundreds of thousands of children working for hire, not counting those working on their own families' farms. But the Fair Labor Standards Act, the federal child labor law, has a different and much lower standard for child labor in agriculture. There's no minimum age to work on a small farm with parental permission. At age 12, children can work for unlimited hours on farms of any size with parental permission, as long as they don't miss school. And at age 16, child farm workers can do work that is considered especially hazardous for children under the law, compared to 18 in every other sector. So Jessica mentioned things that are illegal for hazardous work that's illegal for children to do under age 18, things that are exactly illegal in, say, a Walmart warehouse, driving a forklift, are legal on a farm at age 16 because there is a different standard set in the law. That means that children like Luce are working at far younger hours for far younger ages and under far more hazardous conditions than any children in any other sector. And just to emphasize, the reports of increasing child labor violations reported by the Department of Labor pretty much don't include children in agriculture because so much of their work is legal. A 12-year-old can work 50 to 60 hours a week in the fields, but as long as it's not while school is in session, it's not a violation. Now, there are a lot of myths around the wholesome agricultural lifestyle, but in fact, most child farm hands are poor. Most are Latino, and they're some of the most marginalized children in America. I've interviewed children who have detasseled corn and sorghum and hoed sugar beets and cotton and pumpkin and harvested cucumbers, tomatoes, oranges, apples, blueberries, peaches, tobaccos, cherries, and who've cut down and hauled Christmas trees. And these children told me that they just dreamed about jobs with air conditioning. Jobs like in McDonald's or the Piggly Wiggly grocery store, and that when school ended for summer vacation, they were filled with dread because their vacation was no vacation. It was just hard work. We found that children typically start working around age 12, that there's some influence by what the law is for working on a large farm with parental permission, sometimes age 11. But I also interviewed plenty of children who worked on and off sooner, including children as young as 7 years old. Now, when I say they're working full time, that usually means 10 or more hours a day. At the peak of the harvest, that's daylight to dusk with very few breaks, 6 or 7 days a week, depending on the weather. And most of the children I interviewed made far less than US minimum wage, especially when they were working on piece rate. When it comes to health and safety, agriculture is the most dangerous industry open to children in the US. Children die in agriculture at 4 times the rate of other sectors, and there are thousands who are injured each year. They work in extreme heat, they're exposed to toxic pesticides, and in tobacco fields, they're exposed to nicotine. I want to tell you about a 13-year-old girl I met in North Carolina. My colleagues and I met in North Carolina. We called her Elena, and she started working in tobacco at age 12 with her mother and older sisters. She was working topping tobacco in the field. The summer in North Carolina, it's absolutely stifling. But Elena said she had to bring her own water from home. But still, she had to leave her water bottle at the end of the row. So she wasn't, when she got thirsty, she had to wait till she got all the way back to the end of the long row before she could have a drink. She said, I'd get really thirsty and I would try to make spit in my mouth. She also said she had no appetite. She felt really nauseous and faint a lot of the time. Those symptoms, which are made worse by heat, are consistent with acute nicotine poisoning or green tobacco sickness. Nicotine can be absorbed through the skin, and in the harvest, children absorb it through their hands. If you're stacking up tobacco leaves, you absorb it through your armpit. It's worse when the tobacco is wet. And children also described working in tobacco barns where they dry a certain kind of tobacco. They would be balancing on planks across the rafters, 2 stories tall, and sometimes they would fall off. On other crops, I talked to children who talked about climbing up tall ladders, carrying 90-pound sacks of oranges. One boy told me that he had been using a chainsaw to cut Christmas trees since he was 12 years old. Children also talked about driving tractors, being in car accidents in the old trucks that they would take out to the fields. They described working with knives they had to buy from the dollar store that they wore out in a month. And some showed me their hands with fresh and old scars on them. There was a 16-year-old cutting greens in Michigan who said he'd been cut so many times. He said, you're just bound to get sliced. And I saw a lot of kids working barefoot and without gloves. In addition to the health and safety issues that kids face, it also hurts their education, both the work itself and kids who are migrating for work. Farm worker children in the US drop out about 4 times the national average. Migrant children told me about leaving school early in April or May, and then coming back to school weeks or even months after school has already started. They don't go to prom, can't join the football team or the cheerleading squad because they aren't there when it starts or ends. And children who try to combine working and going to school often find that school is what pays the price, because you'll remember that there are no limits on how many hours children can work in agriculture outside of school hours. I talked to a 14-year-old girl in Florida who hadn't had anyone in her family graduate from high school, and she told me, if I finish school, I'm just going to desplegar como un pavo real. I'm going to shine like a peacock. But it was hard. I know we want to have time to talk about what should be done.
No,
I'd also love for you to ask
that.
me about why agriculture is treated differently than all other forms of labor in the US. But I'll stop there.
Thanks. And now, hopefully, Benjamin, can I ask you what the enforcement measures are of the conventions, and also what's a possible solution to this upsurge in child labor?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. So when I was talking about the conventions, they do require states to put in place enforcement mechanisms, and this is critical. And so establishing a minimum age is one thing, but then having a labor inspectorate that's capable of effectively enforcing it is another. And around the world, developed countries as well as developing countries, this is a challenge. There aren't enough labor inspectors to visit with the regularity to effectively enforce many times child labor regulations. But building up the capacity of labor inspectors, whether and in the U.S., whether federal or state, to be able to enforce the laws is critical. Worst forms of child labor are often in a particular category. They're crimes. So when you talk about commercial sexual exploitation or trafficking, things like that. So that goes beyond labor inspectors to involve the judiciary, police, border agents, and so on. And so again, it's important that they understand and are able to detect what are often quite hidden forms of child labor, and they're up against it. To be honest, that we just published an estimate of the profits of forced labor, forced labor of children and adults, that is in the neighborhood of $236 billion of profit annually. So can you imagine how that dwarfs the enforcement capacity in many countries, even in developed countries? So I think it is about also making sure that we're not re-victimizing children. So too often what you see is in the case of commercial exploitation, that children, 16, 17-year-olds, are actually prosecuted for being caught up, and when in reality children can't give away their rights. They're and they should be treated accordingly as the victims that they are. So just a final word on enforcement. It's a big topic, but as Zema pointed out, most child labor is in agriculture, and most is driven by poverty. So an enforcement first approach. What are you going to do when it's parents who have very few other options than to bring their children to work? So it's often not the best approach, and that's where well-trained labor inspectors, but also community monitoring systems can help. And it's about finding alternatives to child labor and addressing those root causes of child labor, and that's brings in other elements that go beyond enforcement, like social protection, like poverty alleviation, and promoting decent work, again, for parents, so that they can not resort to child labor.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Jess, can you mention how can you prevent the rollback of state legislatures' preventative measures?
Well, I think it is difficult to sort of turn the tide. I think advocacy, strong advocacy, and explaining the dangers of the rollbacks, in particular around, I think, in two ways. I completely agree. We need a holistic approach and to address root causes. But I think if you under-resource enforcement, and if state agencies are not involved in enforcement, companies and subcontractors can act with impunity. And so we are seeing, I think, when state agencies or the Department of Labor takes a different approach, there is more deterrence. So just this March, for example, the Department of Labor actually required a Tennessee manufacturer to pay a substantial fine for illegally employing 10 children in hazardous occupations, but to also reallocate $1.5 million in profits to compensate victims. And I think that sort of blended approach that enforcement agencies can take, could signal a shift towards actually remedying harms. I think again, pointing out potentially to the companies and corporate actors that are actually funding some of the lobbying campaigns to roll back state protections, that state age verification processes, permitting, actually provides a level of protection for companies, right? Because you can actually, verify and the ages of children and ensure compliance in a way by relying on an external party or external permitting agency. So I think that there are ways of combating it. And the other solution, in my view, is actually partnering with companies themselves to, enhance their own compliance processes consistent with generally accepted international standards and U.S. Regulatory standards as well. So I think getting the private sector on board to advocate against those rollbacks is another way of pushing for change.
Is there any way of fining or imposing criminal penalties on employers of children in hazardous labor? Or you'd have to find them first, I guess.
Well, yes, I mean, that's the challenge. And typically what we've seen in these labor investigations is civil penalties for the companies, and in some cases, not even for the parent companies when there's a subcontractor involved. And that's another way for parent companies to kind of insulate themselves from liability.
Yeah. And Zema, what progress can be made against the use of child labor? Big question.
Yeah. Well, I think when it comes to agriculture, there are three entities that can do a lot. But I want to just start out and say it's not out of concern for children's poverty that we have a big loophole in U.S. child labor law for agriculture. The roots of the agriculture exemption in the U.S. is ugly and it's racist. And when Congress adopted the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, it excluded agricultural workers to deny Black people opportunities for economic freedom, and now is having a racist impact on the kids, the majority of whom are Latino, and bearing the burden of a different set of protections for them. So I just want us to push back and say, while kids are working often to put food on the table, the difference isn't a poverty alleviation program. It has much more racist roots. And you have to ask, why is Congress, which has the power to close that loophole, willing to tolerate a different standard for mostly poor Latino children? So that goes to the first thing that needs to be done, and that's to close the loophole in the Fair Labor Standards Act. There are actually bills both in the House and the Senate right now that are both called the Children's Act for Responsible Employment in Agriculture, the CARE Act. Both of those would raise the age of children who can work in agriculture to age 14 and set hazardous work at age 18, just the same as it is for all other working children. The second, though, is that the U.S. Department of Labor doesn't have to wait for Congress to act, because it can control what jobs are considered too hazardous for children. Now, it has two different lists, thanks to Congress. It has a list for under 18-year-olds in non-agricultural jobs, and a list for under 16-year-olds in agricultural jobs. But what's on that list, it can control through its regulatory powers. And we've called on them to update that list. It hasn't been updated since the 70s in agriculture, and take things off that are dangerous for kids in agriculture. The Department of Labor tried to do that under the Obama administration, and they got a lot of pushback, including from industry and farm associations, and they dropped it and have refused to use their power to keep kids in agriculture safe in the same way that all other working kids, at least under age 16, are somewhat protected. The third is companies, though, and Jessica mentioned this. I think this is really important. One of the things that we've seen since we started working on tobacco, and I will say all of our reporting on child labor in the U.S., but specifically on child labor and tobacco, is on the Human Rights Watch webpage, hrw.org. Major tobacco companies now buying from the U.S. prohibit their farmers from employing children under age 16. Some of those companies have actually asked the U.S. Department of Labor just to put tobacco on the list so that all companies are held to the same standard. But tobacco companies have actually gone farther than the U.S. Department of Labor, which I think is particularly shocking. So companies can go farther. They can also publicly support legislation to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act to protect children in agriculture, and really show that businesses are not opposed to stronger legislation. And we think they should go public with that. It would also then apply the same rules across the board, and not ask certain companies to go farther than others. Though they certainly should do that in the meantime. And then finally, both the U.S. and elsewhere, they just need to have a lot stronger supply chains with due diligence, smarter audits, There are some companies that have good examples of this, but they can take responsibility for whether children are working in hazardous conditions in order to ultimately put food on Americans' tables. So Congress, the Department of Labor, and companies themselves.
Thank you, Zaman. Do you want to speak about the right to education for child laborers?
Absolutely. I mean, this runs throughout all this. I was thinking as Benjamin was speaking, when he and I met a couple of decades ago, I remember interviewing kids in schools in El Salvador who told me that they would skip school in order to earn money to buy things like black shoes or school uniforms. But first of all, making sure around the world, making sure education is free, including secondary education. And we're also campaigning for free kindergarten, right? Making sure that kids get that full range of kindergarten, primary, secondary education without cost. And one of the things we found in our research all around the world is that when there's costs, especially around secondary education, that tends to hit girls the hardest. But there's almost nowhere in the world. I mean, I've worked, even in Afghanistan and elsewhere, where it's hard to live a life free of poverty without a secondary education. You need that full range of education, but it puts kids, it's really tough. In the US, I talked to kids who were, young people who were their first generation to attend college. They talked about their freshman year being in college and having, they're through a special program to get farm worker kids in college, and having a parent call them and say, we've had a financial crisis. We need you to drop out and come home and work. And the child having to say, if I can stay in school and get an education, I can ultimately help my family more. But what an impossible position to be in. But even the kids themselves were saying, if I can just hold on and get this education, that's our ticket out of poverty.
And generally, does anybody have any other solutions to this upsurge?
If I could, oh, sorry, Benjamin, it looked like you were unmuted.
Go right ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to reinforce Zama's point around compliance, which we touched on. I think compliance programs will be industry specific, but the core elements that are derived from international human rights and business standards, those are the same. And I think we should look to those core elements to inform kind of successful compliance programs as applied to child labor. So incorporating prohibitions into policy documentation, really understanding business partner relationships and doing due diligence, as Zama mentioned, and including contractual clauses on compliance with legal standards, codes of conduct, corporate human rights, child rights policies, in vendor agreements, doing effective monitoring. I think one of the things that those media articles reported on was that monitoring was taking place, but it was only taking place at off hours or in daytime hours, when actually child labor was occurring in the evenings on off hours. And so, really looking to the systems, the risk management systems that companies have in place, and making sure that they are up to, the standards of some of our international covenants and agreements that Benjamin was talking about, I think would go a long way. And if regulators were actually holding businesses accountable to reaching those standards, I think that would be helpful as well. So less of a strict enforcement approach, but more of a constructive, these are the steps you should follow to kind of have a best-in-class compliance program.
And if I may jump in, Elizabeth, just to complement what Jessica said, in terms of compliance, another element that's important to keep in mind, I mentioned that in no country in the world are there enough labor inspectors to effectively monitor what's going on in workplaces. Well, workers themselves can monitor what's happening, and there's a kind of a success story. It's that I've always looked to as inspiring from the U.S., where there were children working in agriculture, in harvesting cucumbers to make pickles, basically. And the union, Farm Labor Organizing Committee, led a campaign and raised a lot of awareness and grievances with the company, not the owners of the farms, but the multinational companies that were buying from the farms, and managed to negotiate an increase in the price per pickle that allowed the parents to work without bringing their children along in that sort of piece rate system that was referred to. And so I think that speaks to the importance of organized workplaces and as providing an extra set of eyes and ears and empowering workers to defend their own interests. And they have their children's interests at heart like no one else. And so to complement state enforcement, I think collective bargaining agreements are an excellent way to do that. And, labor shortages are never a good excuse for lowering standards. Let's improve the conditions of work that are on the jobs that are available, and adults will step into them. So I think, how you analyze the problem is important in determining the response. And it certainly isn't that there are a lack of workers. If the conditions were good enough, adult workers would be there.
Thanks so much. And now from the audience, are there any questions you would like to mention? And as I said, if the Q&A is not an icon on the bottom of the screen, go to more and you'll see Q&A. Good, you all did such a good job. Nobody has any questions that they have to ask you.
I see one question for me, I think. I can read it. In the case of when a company like PSSI, for example, are caught and penalized for using exploitative child labor, would the owner of the respective portfolio companies be penalized as well? Is this or should this be enforced? Is there any legislation that will enforce risk disclosure for investors, et cetera? On risk disclosure for investors, that's something that we are tracking. I think beyond general ESG and materiality disclosures, I haven't seen specific child labor disclosures required, but obviously you could argue that those would be material and those should be disclosed. So but I haven't seen anything specific on the topic of child labor. In terms of PSSI and parent companies, I think that's exactly what we need to be advocating for. And there is federal legislation pending that has been introduced that would seek to hold parent companies liable. But I think that is another loophole in the system, right, where you can subcontract out and then claim that you don't know what's going on. So use of subcontractors and then outsourcing kind of agencies, temporary employment agencies and the like, the so-called fissured workplace is really an issue that needs to be addressed. And so the other I think corollary to that is working with companies to prevent that kind of subcontracting from actually taking place and employing people directly. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. And then Zema, there's a question for you. Can you unmute, Zema?
Yes, sorry, I'm just trying to
okay.
Oh, how hopeful I am about it. Would that I have a crystal ball to know whether the U.S. Department of Labor is going to update the hazardous occupation orders. My hope is that they'll do the right thing. I find it an outrageous discrepancy and one that can actually be fixed. But I'm pretty taken by the description of the folks who were involved in the previous effort and how what is the right way to say it? How impacted they were by the pushback. I mean, to me, this is a no-brainer. There's a regulatory power. It protects kids, most of whom are Latino and poor, in a sector that has much higher death and industry rates than all other forms of child labor. but I think there's a lot of reticence, and so I hope that they will do that. I hope we then see fewer kids getting injured and dying on farms. But I've been disappointed. I've been disappointed to date, especially something where we know what the fix is. It's not that complicated. I will say there continues to be, this myth about wholesome agricultural work, and also this idea that it's just kids working on parents' farms. Now, for one thing, none of these rules even apply to family farms, so kids can continue to do the activities that are very dangerous for them on families' farms, even if these loopholes were closed, for better or for worse. But I think it's been used for political purposes, and members of Congress are not getting big bucks from Latino farm worker kids, and they're essentially throwing them under the bus. I'd like to. I believe that can change, but the evidence alone has not been sufficient.
Thanks. And we have a question from Anonymous, which anyone can answer. Who is the right organization to contact when you suspect exploitation of child labor? Anyone? Whom should they contact?
I would say state or state enforcement agencies, or the Department of Labor Wage and Hours Division.
Yeah. Okay. Another question: what role could state auditors play in this? I think I just lost the whole question.
I can take this one as well, as I think Good. It's U.S. focused, but I think it's again adopting a set of best practices and ensuring. I think Benjamin was talking about ensuring appropriate staffing, that when you're going in to do these audits, that they're actually meaningful given the risks that are relevant to the particular business. I think that's a really big one. It's about how to be as rigorous as possible in conducting the audits, and doing it in a consistent way, like pursuant to best practices that are established. I think there is work to be done in the social audit space in terms of best practices and determining kind of what those are and socializing them. And that's something we're also looking into, because I think it's very important to have that third-party validation. I don't know, Zema, Benjamin, if you have other thoughts.
Well, I would say that this due diligence on the part of companies is absolutely critical, but child labor is difficult to detect, and you don't have typically a grievance mechanism that would work for children. They're the last ones that are likely to raise the red flag. So it takes real effort, and who is part of those due diligence efforts matters. So companies should be doing stakeholder engagement and speaking with the communities and the workers and their supply chains if they want to put in place effective kind of due diligence and monitoring, auditing approaches. Auditing, doesn't have a tremendously successful record, particularly when it comes to dealing with child labor. So it's been pretty well discredited. Too often, companies are sort of have a go it alone approach and are not linking with labor inspection with government, and so that's an area where there is a lot of room for improvement. I did want to mention just on the enforcement piece, and it's a bit related to the question of who do you go to. At the international level, the U.S. has ratified Convention 182, and so they're required to report on a regular basis. They have been, the U.S. has been found by the committee that looks at these reports, that issue of 16 as the minimum age for hazardous work in agriculture has been raised. And so, the ILO is a multilateral forum for dialogue about these issues. Many countries aren't there in terms of full implementation of the conventions, but the unique thing about the ILO is that it's tripartite. You have workers and employers organizations as well as governments. So trade unions in the US, employers organizations in the US can comment on those and have a role in our supervisory mechanism, as we call it, of those conventions. So just to note that particular opportunity for raising kind of the big picture questions with regard to implementation of Convention 182. 138 hasn't been ratified in the U.S. They're one of the 11 countries that has not been ratified, and the domestic laws that have been referred to are completely out of sync with Convention 138. So it doesn't mean that they need to be in place before ratifying. Most countries ratify first and then work to adapt it to the national legislation. So there's no impediment in that regard to ratification of 138.
Thanks so much. Are there any other questions from the audience? No, if not, any other comments from our expert panelists? And if not, I
maybe
just
I'll
want...
just
Yeah,
just
go
want to
ahead.
highlight one thing. I think, I've been working in this sector a long time on education, on child labor. And I think sometimes it's disappointing for people to hear that there's not a single magic bullet. There's not like one thing like enforcement or that's gonna get kids out of dangerous work or get them into school. And I just encourage our audience members to not be overwhelmed by that. Just in the same way that we need, fair wages and fair working conditions for adults. We need strong minimum wage age standards. We need, laws that track international standards. We need schools that are free and that are of high quality so that they're actually returns on education. There's more than one thing that needs to be done, but these are all possible things, and to just not to feel discouraged that there's not one solution that we can work on multiple fronts at the same time, and that it really is possible to get a lot more kids in school and to decrease rates of hazardous child labor for kids. There are things that can work. It's not just inevitable poverty. It is intentional decisions made by individuals who have the power to make different decisions. And people in this audience, people around the US, people around the world also have the power to influence those decisions. And I really encourage you all to keep it up.
Good point. And with that thought, I would like to thank all of our expert panelists for taking the time to be part of this important webinar. And you are all doing such good work with a difficult situation. And I wanted to thank the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section for monitoring it all. Thank you so much.